Our resource person for today is Dr. Vishvesh Kandolkar, who is the Associate Professor at Goa College of Architecture. Dr. Kandolkar researches Goa's architectural history with a focus on early modern church design and the creation of Indo-Portuguese aesthetics and their afterlife. Apart from considering the social aspects of architectural legacies, he also attends to neoliberal co-optations of design influences. His writing on art, architecture, and cultural politics has been published in Economic and Political Weekly, Journal of Human Values, and the Goan, among other publications. Today, Dr. Kandolkar will be speaking on Old Goa, Nova Cidade, building Panjim from the Golden Ruins. Today's session will be a 1-hour session with Dr. Kandolkar's presentation and lecture, and we will have, say, roughly 20 minutes for Q&A. I request you all to cooperate with us and to mute your audio as well as your video options, and use the chat option to, if you have any questions related to the lecture, that you can put it in the chat box and Dr. Kandolkar will answer it as soon as the presentation is over and we open the Q&A session. So once again, welcome Dr. Vishvesh Kandolkar, and thank you for accepting MOCA's invitation to be part of this online session on Zoom.
Thank you. The screen is visible, Natasha?
Yeah, very clear.
Okay, thank you. First and foremost, I would like to thank the curator, Natasha Fernandez, along with her team, for inviting me to do this first online lecture on Museum of Christian Art in Goa. Also, I would like to acknowledge the presence of so many people who have turned in to listen to this talk. Thank you. This talk is dedicated to my cousin, Vijay Kandolkar, and others who have lost their lives to the COVID-19 pandemic. I also acknowledge those staying at home, isolating, who continue to fight the pandemic. Perhaps in that spirit, the online lecture gives me an opportunity to bring to you the story of Goa's past, hoping that it would bring in some form of engagement with the rich history of this region. So without further ado, let me take you on a time travel to unpack the history of the two capitals of Estado da Índia. In 1841, in a bid to separate the image of Saint Francis Xavier from the city of Old Goa, the governor of Goa officially requested the Portuguese crown to shift the relics of the saint from Old Goa to the would-be capital, Panjim. The question, sorry, just give me a second. Yeah, so the question that I ask is that, was the attempt to separate the figure of Xavier from then ruined city of Old Goa merely a symbolic move to shore up the new center of Portuguese power? In just 2 years' time, that is in 1843, Portugal would declare Panjim as the new capital of Estado da Índia. Clearly, the attempt to move the relics to Panjim shows that the symbolic importance of Saint Francis Xavier to shore up the status of Nova Cidade. This is also an indication that while the state was attempting to make a fresh start, it still relied on icons from the former capital, icons which had come to represent the image of Goa as Goa Dourada or Golden Goa. However, Portugal did not allow the Goan authorities to shift the relics of the saint, as it was seen as an integral part of Old Goa. Pamela Gupta says that she has a reflection saying that it was rather difficult for them to separate the image of Golden Goa and the relics, because both the Basilica of Born Jesus, which has survived till date, as well as the relics, were both inextricably linked and therefore cannot be separated. However, apart from the holy relics, there were other things which moved, and this is what the talk is going to be discussing in detail. While Panjim was being promoted as the new center of Estado da Índia in 1843, Old Goa continued to retain its allure despite being in ruins. Now consider another fact, that Old Goa was titled as Velha Goa. Velha is old, and whereas Panjim was said to be a Nova Cidade, new. Think about what the labels of old and new, they do to the naming of cities. It kind of clearly indicates that, okay, here is a new one, and how do you name it? You just simply say new. This talk then looks into tiny fragments of Goa's history to unpack what is meant to abandon Old Goa as the capital and to fortify the image of Nova Cidade. Even as the erstwhile capital was abandoned, its material debris continued to prove useful. The state cannibalized these golden ruins in order to build a new city of Panjim. The transfer of Portuguese India's capital to Nova Cidade was symbolic. It allowed the state to indicate to its citizens the beginning of a new era of progress. In reality, the fortunes of Estado da Índia had continued to decline. For instance, the colonial state found it cheaper to reuse cut stones from the ruined buildings in the former capital rather than quarry anew. Using examples of buildings in Panjim that incorporated materials from Old Goa, this talk will illustrate how the 19th century colonial state could not enhance the status of their new capital without the legacy of the old one. The epithet of Goa Dourada or Golden Goa first emerged due to the commercial success of the city of Old Goa as capital of Estado da Índia in the 16th century. At about the same time, the term Rome of the East was introduced to refer the city as the headquarters of the Catholic Archiepiscopate in Asia. These labels indicate the city's status as an important location for institutions of the state as well as the church, where both relied upon one another for success of their joint venture. However, even as much as the sobriquet Golden spoke to the city's wealth, until the mid-17th century, the term largely referred to the actual architecture of the city. With the arrival of other colonial powers in South Asia from the mid-16th century onwards, such as the Dutch and the British, the city's image began to tarnish. The effect of the weakening of the Portuguese Empire was directly felt on the city of Old Goa, with many abandoning the capital. It is in this context that the state once again evoked the erstwhile image of Goa as Golden Goa. The nostalgic image of Golden Goa was deliberately employed to keep the population, especially the Caçadores and Reinos. Now, these are the two kind of categories of people who were there in Portuguese. Caçadores are mixed blood between the Portuguese soldiers and locals who were married together, and Reinos would be were the other one. So the epithet Golden Goa was deliberately employed for Caçadores and Reinos from fleeing the city, as there was shrinking of wealth and dwindling of trade following a large-scale immigration of people from the city of Old Goa, with recurring pestilences as well as epidemics and frequent attacks from the Dutch. To quote Melkanda Thil, it was at this juncture of mass exodus of Portuguese residents from the city of Old Goa, with an increasing flow of Saraswat Brahmins and Baniyas to the city as bankers, tax farmers, that they evoked a strategy to increasingly use the highly fascinating urban concepts like Golden Goa and Rome of the East. And he says that, of course, immensely inflated imageries, but churned out from the historical processes of the 16th century, which is the plan which we can see here more or less, to dissuade the residents from fleeing away from the city of Goa, the city which was the power center of the Portuguese state in the entire of Asia. End of the quote. And this is what Malakandathil says. Despite the frequent and repeated use of the concept of Golden Goa in the 17th and 18th century, the city of Old Goa underwent steady and irreversible decline. By the end of the 18th century, the city was in considerable ruins, with many domestic and civil structures suffering the effects of the government's abandonment of the city. With the complete disappearance of many important monuments, and we can see that in the plan itself, there were such buildings like Church of Nossa Senhora da Luz, among others. It is difficult to imagine the city of Old Goa at its peak. Today, the buildings in Old Goa appear as if they are intended to be set around large open space. However, when these monuments were constructed in the 16th century, they were part of a dense local urban fabric, like typical cities of early modern period, with building lined along narrow, winding street. Thus, single monuments such as Bon Jesus and Sea Cathedral, as we see them today, did not stand out as prominently from the surrounding landscape as they do today, but were a continuous part of city's fabric. The ruination of inner city networks and the buildings that existed within the city has completely distorted the image of city that once thrived. Apart from the other factors, and this is what I argue, the policies of the Portuguese led to the ruination of Old Goa. By the mid-18th century, the Portuguese state had made a major change in its policy of partnership with the church. Portuguese minister in charge, the Marquis Pombal, wanted Portugal to steer the empire's image away from the religion to reflect the policies of other European empires, such as the British. To remind everyone, the peak of the Portuguese Empire, just as Spanish, was in 16th century. In relying on the religious orders such as the Jesuits, Anana Chakravarti labels the Portuguese as the empire of apostles, especially in the 16th and 17th century. Unlike their Iberian neighbors, the Dutch and the British colonialism was different as they considered themselves as superior powers. According to Pamela Gupta, Pombal kind of earlier had been appointed as Portugal's ambassador to London in 1738 and had been much impressed with the successful maritime economy of Great Britain, promoting it as a mode to be reproduced back home. So upon taking charge of Portugal, Pombal's major decision was the expulsion of the Jesuits from the Portuguese territories in 1759. Faced with the growing strength of the British Empire to keep step, Portugal looked specially to its colonies to retain the vestiges of their greatness, which was obviously much earlier. In addition to the metropole, the colonies underwent dramatic change, including the withdrawal of the Inquisition. However, in the case of Goa, this action of removing the religious orders, which by 1835 was completely removed, further led to the deterioration of the city of Old Goa. The state wanted to dissociate itself from the religion and thus change its image, but the buildings had survived in its capital of the East, so to say, were largely religious ones. Despite the reforms of the Pombaline era, the power of architectural images of Golden Goa continued to hold residents in their thrall, again indicating how Goa's identity at that time was connected to architecture. Unable to distance itself successfully from the hold of the idea of Golden Goa, the state was driven to drastic measures, including attempt to shift the capital itself in 1759. The year 1759, when the Jesuits were expelled, was critical in another respect. It marked the beginning of the official abandonment of the city of Old Goa as a seat of the government. This was a year when Viceroy Iga decided to move the residents from city, which was Old Goa, to downstream to Panjim, and which was Adilcha Palace. Finally, in 1843, Panjim was declared a new capital of Estado da Índia. It was not that the idea to shift the capital had not occurred earlier. As historian Disney clarifies, the suggestion that the capital of Estado da Índia be shifted to Marmagua, and this is down way away in Marmagua, was first put forward at the high level in 1670 by the governing council that succeeded Viceroy São Vicente. In fact, Lisbon had even accepted the Viceroy's argument to shift the capital and had given orders to proceed. However, this was met with opposition from the religious establishment that had invested heavily in buildings and other assets in Old Goa. The Goan city, after all, which is Old Goa, was also an episcopal capital of Asia and served as a headquarters for the religious orders in the East. The image of Goa, Old Goa, was closely associated with the church and religious orders and their monuments there. The state, as one can see in the intent to shift the capital, was clearly trying to secularize its image by distancing itself from the other religious institutions in the city. With the decline of the empire in the 17th century, the Portuguese did not have adequate resources to transfer their capital. Therefore, the initial proposal to move the capital to Marmagua was eventually shelved. In a bid to revitalize the city of Old Goa, Portuguese colonial state, under leadership of Don José Pedro Camara, the governor and Captain General of India, prepared a redevelopment plan for city of Old Goa. One can see it in the plan here. This initiative in 1777 and around 1770s hoped to recapture the former glory of Old Goa as the capital of Portuguese India. These plans were never implemented. Despite not being fulfilled, these plans was proposed to breathe life into the capital of Estado da India, especially through sociality it would imagine would return. The plan would restructure Old Goa with network of orthogonal streets and squares, which would completely override the layout of the older city. The revitalization of colonial city was inspired by Marquis Pombal's redevelopment. And I'll just show you one of the slides. And this here is redevelopment of Lisbon. After Lisbon had been flattened out by the earthquake in 1755 and the fire which followed, Marquis Pombal took upon himself to redo Lisbon. And what he proposed was once again overlaying orthogonal grid over what was essentially a medieval city. And this is what he succeeded in doing after that. So one can see the correlation between the plans which is done here in Lisbon to that of Old Goa, which I showed earlier. I'll just show you very quickly the image of as the slide transitions into the next, sorry. Yeah, so this is the aerial view of Lisbon, which we can see this is the part where the orthogonal grid was eventually overlaid. And we can see how the city itself looks, which was based on Pombal's plan of Lisbon. The Lisbon inspired, and one can see the inspiration here, the Lisbon inspired restructuring of Old Goa hoped to provide a new streetscape that would attract people to return to the capital. As they moved through the proposed unnamed streets here, people would have to imagine the city not as the one with pestilence and decay of the medieval circumlocutive alleyways, the winding alleyways, but as a modern capital of the empire, fashioned after the metropole. In analyzing this plan of Old Goa, I argue that the revisioning of Old Goa through wide, linear streets would have allowed a visual display of the interior of the city, especially its 16th, 17th century monuments. And one can see every place that there is a square which is proposed, which is the blank street, which is superimposed over the other streets, there is a monument attached to it. These monuments had survived despite the decline of the capital. Accordingly, in the new plan, these older monuments would not just perform religious functions, but become visual landmarks for people on the streets. In other words, the proposed streetscape would use linear design to reframe the city as a spectacle. In doing so, the Portuguese colonial state expected not only to visually highlight the city's legendary architecture, whether they were monuments as St. Augustine's, Basilica Bon Jesus, Sea Cathedral, St. Francis of Assisi, or in this case, we have the St. Cajetan's. They wanted to make this as part of the spectacle, framing them against the open spaces that they had proposed. But creating new public spaces, the residents would also gather in these spaces, creating kind of a new socially while admiring their heritage. The integration of the religious monuments as a part of the commercial and residential layout of the newly envisaged city is keeping with the secularization that Portugal had embarked upon in that period, a move that also encompassed the colonies. In Old Goa, even as the state distanced itself from the church, which means the body of the church, it still relied on the cultural legacies of the ecclesiastical buildings in attracting people back to the streets of the city. Therefore, the importance of this redevelopment plan is in its envisioning a new urbanism in Portuguese India, although this would prove to be the last attempt to reviving Old Goa. Indeed, the Pombal's plan to completely rebuild the city of Old Goa failed. And Disney, here historian again, reflects, it's saying that it was unrealistic and unenforceable and effectively lapsed after he left office. Described the city of Old Goa in 31 book, Courtney Klugen, who has done this map. You can see these buildings which are in this map. Those buildings which are survived, he's drawing them as a figure and ground. Others here, he's clicking and drawing them as ruins. It's a very informative plan. And he says that at this time, when he went there in 1830, 1820s, 1830s, he says that there are very few people, and he asked the oldest men there, and they assured him that this was the best he had seen the city for longest time. He says that 2 of the parish churches are abandoned and in ruins. Others, except the cathedral, are fast decaying, being only open on Sundays and festival days. Essentially, everything is in disrepair. And people, he says, not amounting more than 200 to 300 people. And this is what his claim is in 1820s. Now, consider that, another quote, consider that in 1835, after he has observed it, the Portugal decreed all the religious order to be thrown out of Old Goa, which means, you can see this is a plan by Lopes Mendes, which is done in 1886, which means the city underwent further decay after they threw out the religious, all the other religious orders in 1835. This led to abandonment of city and ruination of Old Goa, and even the priests and clergy who were working here were gone, which means there was no life here now anymore. And clearly, the ruination of city, if not directly, was partly due to the policies of Portugal. I'm not saying that Portugal wanted it to be declined, but their association in the early 16th century, and they're slowly falling apart with the church, with the religious orders, kind of led to the deterioration and abandonment of the city itself. In fact, historian Celsa Pinto, in her very interesting book, she says that if Pombal himself had to supervise the reconstruction of Old Goa, the story perhaps would have been different today, because he was the one who would have done it, like, with kind of an iron fist. But Goa and Goans not to be. Nevertheless, I just want to reflect upon planning of Panjim. Ultimately, in a bid to project a more secular image of Portuguese state, especially after Pombaline reforms, the capital of Estado da Índia was shifted to Panjim in 1843. Well, this is just to give you the context. I'll change the slide. The fact is also that the same period that Pombal ordered to develop, he had also ordered to develop Old Goa, he had also ordered to develop Panjim, as can be seen in the plan which is on the slide. If this was what development of Panjim looked like, this is what was proposed, and one can see that the red one on top is a church. And this is one can see the orthogonal layout of the city itself, and the river Mandovi being down. So if this is itself was a thing, what was there before? And this is the plan. What was there before? So here is a survey plan before Panjim was developed. One can see the Mahalakshmi temple and the road which is skirting Adil Shah Palace going to the church and going down can be seen on the plan. But center of it were fields and coconut groves. To state the obvious, Panjim was a village. Nevertheless, the redevelopment plan, one can see that in more detail here, and there are a few monuments which are lying there. We can go in more detail at some point of time, but one can see that the redevelopment plan was inspired by Lisbon. And here, centered down there, one can see also that there is a commercial square which is similar to the Praça de Comercio in Lisbon that was proposed there. So development of the city of Panjim did not follow the same, but it kept the spirit of the Pombaline plan. Just to give you a follow-up of evolution, this is what it looked like, this plan 1888, this plan and then subsequent plan, which again, I would like to acknowledge Fernando and Ali Santiago Faria for sharing this plan with me. But one can see clearly that, inspired by Pombaline development, what didn't happen in Old Goa was attempted back in Panjim. So therefore, when Panjim was, one question again is that, okay, fine, Panjim is being now developed as a capital. What is happening to Old Goa? So let's just return to the story of Old Goa once again. And this is what Richard Burton has to say about Old Goa, and with all the things I'm going to read out, but he says that he came here in 1850s and he was reflecting about what was happening in Old Goa. So he goes and he travels to Old Goa. He takes a walk around the city, and he says that Old Goa has few charms where, seen by the light of the day, there are few things to see here. And he reckons around 30 buildings. Okay, most of them were falling to ruins, and others were had been partially demolished. And he says that the extraordinary amount of havoc committed during the last 30 years, and I don't know how he got this, perhaps through his interviews, is partly owing to the poverty of the Portuguese. And here he's reflecting upon what, the comparison of the British and the Portuguese. So one has to be a little careful here. But nevertheless, but he says, and this is important, like the modern Romans, they found it cheaper to cut away cut stone than to quarry it. But unlike the inhabitants of the eternal city, they have now no grand object in preserving the ruins. Okay, end of the quote. Of course, we must take what Button says with a pinch of salt, as after all, he was a British officer at that time. Nevertheless, Richard Burton reveals that the Portuguese state did not have the financial capacity to safeguard Old Goa's architectural heritage. However, what is interesting is that the debris that resulted from ruination of monuments in Old Goa was often harvested, cannibalized, recycled for the use in other locations across Goa. And I'm just going to give you a few examples. One such example is the transfer of the second heaviest bell in Goa, weighing around more than 2,000 kilos, from St. Augustine's Church. First, and this Vasco in his book, which is a very nice book, he records these things, and he says that first the church moved from Old Goa to Fort Aguad, and subsequently by 1840s, 1842, just before Panjim becomes the capital, it was moved to this church, Immaculate Conception, in Panjim. According to historian Paulo Varela Gomes, the facade of the church in Panjim was modified to accommodate this bell, which has become the unique feature of this still existent church. Thus, the debris of monuments in Old Goa did not simply disappear into thin air. Rather, some of these remained and reappeared in new locations. Not only did this transfer of material debris from Old Goa give a new meaning to symbols of the past, but the transferred material also enriched the value of structures to which these artifacts were added, as in this church. The recycling shows that influence of Old Goa on the architecture of other parts of Goa was not merely through design emulations, which means there were beautiful architecture in terms of styles and elements in Old Goa, and the styles which are being replicated in other parts of Goa was not simply through emulations by taking the designs and copying it here, but subsequent to city's ruination, there was physical transfer of the material as well. So while the process of ruination of monuments did lead to the decline of the city of Old Goa, the places that were beneficiaries of the transfer of materials and ideas got fresh lease of life, where the local public could continue to feel nostalgia of the old, quite literally. They were like, yes, directly taking the things and replacing it. So while the ruination of the monuments of Old Goa led to the demise of one city, clearly their material debris would continue to animate the afterlife of many monuments across Goa, including Panjim. Again, what I want to do now is just very briefly, go through Panjim, and this is the exercise which Fernando, architect Fernando, who is there in in the audience, we had done this exercise. We went about in Panjim looking for, searching for, like detectives, where are these, recycled leftovers in Panjim itself. So we went out looking around, and I want to acknowledge Ali Santiago Faria, because her own paper looks at, there were ads in newspaper, Santiago Faria writes, that saying that material debris on sale, auction of the material debris from Old Goa. So there was not just, I'm not just saying that there was overnight going and stealing the debris and coming and building a new capital. No, there was official auctioning, and auctioning states that it's a policy of the state to now remove the debris, recycle it, and use it somewhere else. But also one can see the removal and recycling is actually eating into the old city. So it's kind of a cannibalistic to some extent, and allowing it to have advertisements and other things shows that really what Burton says, that there is no grand vision in trying to keep this as vestiges of the past. And perhaps it is many people, including Neri Xavier and many others, who then raises voices to say, we need to keep the capital, we need to save our heritage, and those are the people who then starts pushing the state to retain some of the heritage in Old Goa and of course also in Panjim. But let's go very quickly, acknowledging Vasco and other people's work. Also this work was done, Vivek Menezes was part of this for Serendipity, where we were talking about Panjim 175, and it was a similar time that we were recording some of these things earlier. So very briefly, one can see that the remains here, of course, this building was completely remodeled over time. This building is not the same. even if you see the pictures of this building, over time, the building has changed. So we don't know how much of the interior has been remodeled, how much of the buildings have been remodeled, but we can clearly make out the entry doorway, which is there, right? That's the one. Those are the things which have been reassembled. They've been bought from debris from Old Goa and been put together now to give it a little more elegance, if one would say, relying on the vestiges of the past. Further, this on the left is the collectorate building, right? And one can see that the same kind of, this is a bassin stone, if I may recall, and I think so Fleur D'Souza, who is here, who is talking very passionately about Thane, Bassin, and Chaul, was indicating how from the northern provinces, many of the laterite, many of the hard stones, granite stones were bought in because you could do those classical carvings with this stone. So many of the stones were in fact imported all the way from Bassin. They came to Old Goa, but I'm sure the state in the 19th century didn't have this kind of resources to bring in the thing. So what they do, simply bring the material from Old Goa and then start decorating and trying to increase the status of the buildings here. Collectorate. And one can see, this is just example of if this is the entryway and the entryway was being decorated by those stone there earlier. Once this building is falling off, you want to secure, you don't have the resources to rebuild this, to protect this. So what you do is that you can say, come on, okay, we have the material here, why don't we reuse it in Panjim? So that's the kind of policy which I say, although it seems like it's an interesting way of looking at it and there is no kind of perspective of looking at the heritage, but still, nevertheless, it is 19th century and one would look at the ruins in a different way. So then again, this is the accounts building. One can still see, I'm sure, this as well. Very quickly, moving to next slide. This is stones in Makanis Plaza. The stones are very old, and these kind of stone slabs which are being used for staircases are not just simply in Old Goa. They are there in many churches and many places. In fact, Varela Gom says that so many of elements of Old Goa has disappeared. Whether they are altarpieces, they are decorative elements of baptismal fonts or many other things, have gone through all places across Goa. So one can really don't know where is this heritage now. One can really map it, and then it becomes kind of a dispersed way in which these things are moving. So moving to next slide. This was recently redone, right, under the smart city mission. This is recently redone. But before it was redone, Fernando and me had gone and photographed this. And clearly the stones, I don't know where they're gone. But again, it's a lost opportunity. And one really questions whether do these vestiges of the past have place in what is called smart city today? Do they? This was again another very important, how do you say, not important in the way in which it looks like yet another piece, small piece perhaps in the larger Golden Goa. But what is the place of this in the current history? Okay, so this was one more case. And today, I mean, sorry to say, I just went there 2 days back to see these things. And okay, here on left hand side, this is a small stone which is next to the Sousa and Paul studio. But this is the state today on the right. It's just lying amidst. If they could have lifted it and thrown in the waste place, but they can't lift it, right? So they tried to just simply move it aside. And what comes in that place is that bull which is there, or bison which is there. So we want to put in new artifacts to make the city beautiful, but there is no appreciation of what is there. And I would like to really recall Anne Stoller, in this case. He says that ruination is more than a process of to use debris as a byproduct. And it's also a political project that lays waste to certain people. Like if this history is disappearing, whose history is disappearing? It's going to be seen, that's a question. So if the history and monuments and artifacts which resembles and represents history of Goan history and Goan people's history, then easily somebody else can replace that history. Okay, so we have to be very careful here in trying to think that the loss of history and materials here is not any loss. It's loss for people who are largely Goans and fighting for trying to save and represent Goa, which is for many people through various ways, whether it is cultural heritage or environmental heritage. All fights are similar fights towards trying to keep our memories of the past and continuing for this heritage for the future generations. Another picture, again, like I said, just lying, those stones are lying there, and the same kind of questions one asks, where is the place for this heritage? And I know, even despite criticism, yes, sometimes they do keep the structures in Old Goa in safe. There are laws and bylaws, all the things. But the materials which have moved to some other places, there is no way of making them into certain kind of monuments. Could we have a special way of mapping this, laying this, keeping there? Maybe there could be AI, we just structure it, AR. Moment we go there, we get certain kind of history. I don't know, there could be more contemporary ways of doing it. But nevertheless, this talk is not so much about what we can do. That is something definitely we can take forward. But the question really is about systematic dismantling. And I'm giving a second case. On the left here is another case of systemic dismantling of Old Goa. And this building on the left is a Dominican building in the 16th century. And this religious structure, which was this left one, extreme left, middle one, which is called I, is actually St. Cajetan's. So this building is behind. There's huge, you can see size of Cajetan's and the monument which is there behind. The religious structure, which was, as Varla Gomes says, largest and richest in Goa, began around 1550 and finished in 1564. And Varela Gomes goes on to add that this church was praised throughout the times as one of the architectural masterpieces of Goa. The facade and some ruins still existed, he said, when he wrote the book in 1850s and even 1873, when the book was written, The Sketch City of Goa by José Nicolas da Fonseca. But it says, unlike the Church of Nossa Senhora de Luz, which we saw earlier, or many other buildings, the disappearance of this particular monuments, I say, can be partially traced. And I will change the slide and show you how and why. So if you see the 12 composite bassin stone columns that are lining the central nave of the church, which was earlier, were reused in a monument dedicated to Alfonso Albuquerque, raised in the main square of Panjim in 1847. This is the particular Alfonso Albuquerque monument which was raised. Now, this is a square-shaped pavilion with the columns from Dominican church lining the four sides, upholding a majestic dome with Doric entablature. Now, bust of Alfonso Albuquerque was originally placed at the center of this pavilion, and it was subsequently removed after Goa's integration with India. And this bust is there, I think so, in the ESI Museum in Old Goa. The point I've been trying to make is that it is clear, that's the column. It is clear that the monumental debris of Old Goa was recycled to create a better image of new capital, as this monument to Alfonso Albuquerque was constructed just 4 years after Panjim was declared the capital of Estado da Índia. In transferring the columns from the Dominican church, material from Old Goa cannibalized for the purpose of constructing a secular monument. Remember this, it's a secular monument heralding the transformation of the political discourse of the empire. As mentioned earlier, the seeds of change in the political discourse were sown as early as in 759 when the Jesuits were expelled from the Portuguese territories. In the 19th century, when Burton visited Goa, on the other hand, the state was dismantling the holy city of Old Goa, and on the other hand, it was recycling the material debris for use in secular monuments in Panjim. Both enterprises revealed the state's discourse of secularization during that period, as the Portuguese colonial state did not offer any grand new architectural monuments on a scale comparable to what it had done in the 16th and 17th centuries. The 19th century was cannibalistically devouring the greatness of Old Goa, which had come to be known as Golden Goa in the early modern period. And one can see 19th century, if one compares it to Bombay, for instance, or British India, where the cathedrals of progress were what is called Victoria Terminus, or those large monuments which are being built. So one cannot simply compare. 19th century, all was being done was either to keep some buildings which are there in Old Goa, or build monuments like this by devouring the past. So in the second half of the 19th century, the state had slowly sanitized the image of Old Goa. Okay, so I just want to go back to see Old Goa. What is happening to Old Goa? The state strategy of selective preservation of Old Goa meant that only few monuments, such as Basilica of Born Jesus, were propped as evidence of Goa's golden past in the city itself. Okay, with the failure of the states, its lack of resources, it's demonstrated in its reuse of old materials to build new monuments and culling the older ruined monuments instead of repairing them, meant that only select few monuments such as Born Jesus were left to prop up the erstwhile legacy. By only having to maintain few monuments, expenses are lowered clearly, as a state is able to concentrate its propaganda on efforts around a select number of edifices. Furthermore, the clearing of cities' ruins, which lay in between these preserved edifices, created a large foreground. We have seen in the plans earlier, right? This is not the way in which buildings were there in Old Goa. They were full. All these, what is called foreground of the building, were in fact civil and other architecture buildings which were there. But gazing at these monuments remnant from a distance would have further exaggerated the monumentality, thereby emphasizing the image of Golden Goa. I'm not going into details of really the removal of the thing and what photography brings to the thing, and which is going to be a part of my next talk, upcoming talk. It's a different talk. I didn't want to focus on that one here. But for those of you who are interested, I'm looking at the visual history of the basilica itself, because there's a particular way in which some monuments remain, others go away. And over time, the basilica itself has become such an iconic thing that we have forgotten what it looked like and what its look was made possible, photography, for example. So that is part of a separate lecture for those who are interested. But coming back, as for Panjim, as I have been demonstrating, the 19th century colonial state could not enhance the status of their new capital without the legacy of the old one. So thank you for your attention. And I would just like to briefly acknowledge the works that I have relied upon: Fernando Vello, Savia for providing things, Central Library, which has fantastic resources, and some of the old pictures is still there in that thing. Ali Santiago Faria, of course, and many others. Yes. So again, once again, thank you for those things. I think so. I'll ask Natasha as I move on to the last slide. I'll stop sharing and we can have questions. I'll look into the some of the comments which have come in, and if some of you want to raise hands, then I can even take those questions. But Natasha, tell me how we are doing in terms of time.
We have roughly 12 minutes for Q&A.
Okay.
We have some observations here. If you look at the chat from...
I'll just stop the sharing the screen.
Yes, sure.
And yeah, I will look at the chat now.
Yes, so we are open to questions from the participants, but a few observations that have come in from Luis, who says, like we all know, the stone staircase in the house that Luis stays in also is from the vestiges of Old Goa. And Karishma also has a comment here, which I think is a very relevant one of the problematic restoration works in various places, and in this case, the steps at Altino.
Yeah. No, in fact, when Fernando and me went on a walk, it was quite surprising that, it's one thing to be nostalgic and say, okay, we have lost a lot of things, but it's another thing to really map. And I think there's a smarter way of thinking about heritage. And one has to think about mapping some of these things to reflect upon the past. Also, I think so I wanted to unpack the history, because oftentimes, the entire 451 years of so-called Portuguese history is seen as a monolithic history. That there's one thing which happens, there's a story of whether it is Inquisition, Portuguese state, empire, and then it's flattened out to think about it as one single block. But to unpack that and think about that, no, there were many things which were happening within that. There was internal fights. The church itself was being split. There was these various religious orders which were conflicting with one another, throwing out of Jesuits. All this speaks about complexity about our history, and we must also then reflect about how this then impacts the city itself. So while today Panjim still continues to be a capital of Goa, there is lots to learn from what has been happening in the past.
There is a question here from about the doorway of the Adil Shahi Palace near Cajetan's Church, and whether it's really the doorway of the Adil Shahi Palace.
So this Adil Shah Palace, with the question which is being asked is regarding the question which in Old Goa. So what they had done, I think so there is Joki Santos, who again I acknowledge in my talk. In fact, it is in 1930, if I'm not mistaken, that there was suddenly in there was around 1898, there was a establishment of some kind of trying to keep the heritage. So there was kind of heritage movement in Goa, and they said, let's keep things. And when they went about seeing things, they found some leftover stones at that point, and then they just simply lifted it up. And he claims that it is actually a forgery. Forgery meaning it could have been, but it was not really true. And there is pictures and photographs through which he shows that it was actually propped up to show that it is the our way to the doorway to these things. So yeah, in a way.
But we wouldn't know how recent that would be, right?
That is 1930. So there is photographs of that. If Joki Santo's paper deals with it directly in looking at that particular one, that is there.
Okay, there's a question from Angela Ferrao and Fernand. Vishvesh, you would like to answer?
Yeah, I'll just look into the thing. You want to? I can just take some.
I can just read it out.
Raise your hand. Okay, if you want to have very briefly, if you want to ask a question, go ahead, Anup. Just ask the question briefly while I look at this.
Vishwesh, very briefly, I mean, very informative talk. But looking forward in future, I mean, what we have understood from your presentation is cities keep evolving and they keep changing and transforming. Okay. Given the situation of now the old Goa and the new Goa, all right, the old Panjim and new Panjim.
Yeah.
Okay. And in future, maybe 50, 60 years or 100 years down the line, there is a possibility that the two will become one. All right. What is your take on buildings coming close to what we call today as heritage buildings?
So I think so. We have Kishore from sitting in the museum who will say that, see, heritage is one thing. So there's two ways of looking at the heritage. One is to look at the heritage as ongoing representation of a past. And there is a concern that, that if you really don't allow the heritage, and sometimes at heritage sites, you have important artifacts and they requires to be archaeological excavation, etc., which needs to be kept up. So which is why there is a certain kind of guidelines which is given to keep some distances. So I think it's very important that for Old Goa, for instance, that in all its spirit, we need to keep these guidelines in place. Those guidelines are there for some reason over time, and these guidelines requires to be there. And I think so recently with Fernando and some work which is being done, Edgar Ribeiro, in fact, has been championing this cause for a long time in reflecting some of these guidelines into the regional plans. So yes, we have to superimpose these things to think about holistically about city and not simply as growth, which looking at areas of growth purely in trying to extend the city without imagination.
Okay, I think there's a question from Fernando. If you can, Fernando,
you want to ask a question? Fernando?
Fernand, maybe you can ask your question. You can unmute and go ahead and ask. There's also Benedito who has a question. Benedito, maybe you would like to ask the question?
Hi.
Hello.
So, Dr. Kandolkar, my question really has to do with, why have we forgotten? Is it just, is it simply just a matter of this being the past and being relegated to the past, where, forgetfulness can be associated with things just falling by the wayside, new developments occurring, or is there an active component to the loss, right? And I'm asking you here to think about why you think this might be the case, that there is in fact an active occurrence within the forgetfulness, the acts of forgetfulness, and how might those be changed? How might they be mitigated in some ways? Is education a possibility? Is public interaction of this nature a possibility? So yeah, those are my questions.
Thank you for the question. In reflecting, and I think so, I would like to again recall the works of Anne Stoller in the work which she calls imperial debris. The debris or whatever remains is not simply a remain. So there is what is called active, and in Goa we know what is called active destructions, like if there is a highway or if there is a road which comes and goes very close to heritage, and we really want to save that thing. So there's active destructions, but there's also what is called passive destructions. Active destruction happens when there is a new thing you want to do overriding the old, and this is where it is directly imperial. Doesn't matter who is doing it; it's imperial in nature. Whereas forgetting, deliberately forgetting is also a way in which we can allow, like for example in Goa with the monsoons we have, if we keep the heritage to lie without taking care of it, then it will go away. So these are the two techniques normally that usually used to forget. And the forgetting is also because that you're required to forget particular kind of history. Like say, artifacts are not simply, again, it represents some people. So forgetting this heritage is also forgetting people to whom this heritage belongs. And the dangerous connection here is what I also been arguing, is that there is a close connection to the community who thinks that artifacts belongs to them versus the artifact themselves. So there is a responsibility on parts of whether it is ASI or whether it's a government survey or many things, to keep these artifacts as part of living memory of people's thing, because they are the experts. On the other hand, there is a mapping and other exercises which are required to remember these things. And I think so part of the exercise is to remember that. Lastly, education, yes. We need to have more of these things being either in whether it's textbook or having small kind of walks in the city or educational walks in the city. But we think so will require more from all directions to discuss the history as active history and not something which is, we can't think, oh, this is the Portuguese past. No, it's a Goan past and it's Goan present. The monuments are not of the past. They're reminders of our present, and we need to care for them.
Absolutely, Vishvesh. And we'll not take any more questions after this. This is the last one. It's from GM. If you can go through his question, or if you can come on the video and unmute and ask your question.
Vishvesh?
Yeah.
I'll ask. Should I go ahead, Vishvesh?
Go ahead.
Yes, please do.
Dr. Vishvesh, first of all, a very nice presentation. My question is, was the decay of Portuguese power the sole reason for shifting of Old Goa to Panjim as the capital, or the Nova Cidade? Because I read, as per Malakandithil, he says that the rampant misuse of essentials like water, etc., was the reason for the decay of the city of Old Goa. And this resulted in the Portuguese population deserting Old Goa, and which made the Portuguese crown relent the order relating to religion and requesting locals to come and join the mainstream to take care of the city. Can you please clarify on that?
Yeah.
And having said that, the government of Goa town planning department has acknowledged the need of including part of Old Goa into the greater city, greater Panjim PDA as per today's TCB board meeting.
I see. Thank you for that question, Gomakant. Yes, I think so. Usually there is always a single reason which is given for the decay, and it's not true. Any decay of a city, there is no single reason for the downfall. Here, in this case, Old Goa, there is a centralization of power, and I would not want to go too much in detail, but the rise of the Portuguese, the fall of the Portuguese also because of the rise of the Dutch and the British. There were more wealth now coming into the other territories. There is a fall of Vijayanagara Empire. So essentially, what was 16th century greatness disappears, the wealth goes down, the power center shifts to other places, and then within that, there are then pestilences and other things which you cannot, if you don't have the money, you can't take care of the pandemic, right? You're required to be resourceful in taking care of pandemic, and that leads to downfall. And there is also, it's a different talk altogether, but how the local Goans, essentially the Brahmins and Shardas in Goa, were trying to undo what is happening in Old Goa by building smaller, almost like a fiefdom. So if you see, there's a lot of investment in churches, which are parish churches or other places. So that's a parallel history which is going on. Rather than investing in one center, there are many other places which were large monuments were coming up. But again, part of a different discussion. But thank you for the question.
Vishvesh, can I?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just, it's not a question, it's just to add certain things, when we were previously, I think with Anup or someone was talking about the monument heritage, So what I really felt in Goa, because last 4 years I was in Goa, I worked in different places. But here what I have noticed about the awareness about the national legislations, regarding a monument. See, somewhere we also lack. ASI also lack into that, making awareness about your national policies, So here all over India, it's not has been done properly. So that's why there is always a conflict, between the people, between the government organization, and then your heritage, So and somewhere we lack about the national policies also. There is not a single national policy all over India, So somehow, like I feel that, So I think that will be another good session where we can really make an awareness towards the people about the monument heritage. There are laws are there, as you told about the flyovers which is coming around. So it depends on you how the government is looking in terms of development. We are looking in terms of it is destroying our heritage. So now it has to be a basic understanding, of communication between both. So these are the things actually where we really lack, and which has to be highlighted to really understand about the monument, or when you say about the heritage.
I think so. Would not agree with you more, because everybody wants the preservation of heritage, but again, there is contestations of how and why. But I think so. It's true that again, Natasha, thank you for hosting sessions, because you can do the best thing you can do in a museum is to put these artifacts as almost removed from the part of culture. But when you see city itself as a museum, then it's more than simply a museum, because you're not going there passively disengaged with the reality of what is ongoing sound and noise of the city, and you're seeing the artifacts and you want to appreciate it. So yeah, I agree with Karishma, who says that yes, maybe there should be walks, and Karishma pointing out that surely there is a way of engaging with the city of Panjim itself and reflecting into the past. And similarly, I have also acknowledged the questions by Luis saying that yeah, we need to look more into some of the artifacts, not just looking at official ones, but other places. But thank you so much for all those questions, and for all the attention that we have had. And Natasha and
Thank you, Vishvesh. It has really been a very interesting talk by you, and I think we'll all be looking at Old Goa and Panjim. When we walk through Panjim and Old Goa, we'll be looking at it through different eyes now. Just to go back to Louis, Louis had a question about Basine stone. I'm just scrolling back to that one, the proximity.
Quarries.
About the quarries, yes.
Yeah, can you hear? Yeah, is this stone still available, or is it finished?
So this question is to Fleur, who is from Bombay, and she's doing some of the studies there. And I think that's all gone. The quarries are all gone.
Vishvesh, may I just say?
Yeah, please go ahead, Fleur. Fleur D'Souza is a historian from Bombay.
Bombay, yes.
And please go ahead.
On a trip to Dharavi Island, not Dharavi, the slum, there's a Dharavi Island which is just opposite Basine Fort on the creek. And there is a stone quarry that is still to be seen. So I'll share with Louise perhaps the picture of that stone quarry. And you can see that the way the hillside is quarried, that you could cut out blocks of stone about at least 20 or 25 feet in height.
I see.
Even David Cardo's, conservation architect from Bombay, he agreed with me when I showed him that picture. That yes, and so there are more than one quarry or leftovers of the quarries on Dharavi Island still to be seen.
I see. Interesting.
Yeah. You know that in Bombay there was what we call the Malad stone. So the little yellow stone, yellowish colored stones that Vishvesh showed was also called the Malad stone. Now, Malad is heavily urbanized today, so I doubt you would find instances of that stone still seen. But if you're traveling on the Western Express Highway from Andheri to maybe Borivali, on the right-hand side, covered under a lot of the smog and smooth of the kind of petrol dust and dirt, if you had a keen eye, you would still see evidence of a Malad stone. So there are a few places, but not a quarry. Whereas on Dharavi Island, you can still see the leftovers of a quarry.
I see. Thank you so much for that answer.
Thank you, Fleur, for that, and thank you again, Vishvesh, for this really very interesting session on the ruination of Old Goa and how Panjim came about and not the monuments of Panjim. And with that, I think we will conclude now. We've just gone over an hour, but it was all well worth it. Interesting session, many insights and comments from our participants. So once again, thank you to you, Dr. Vishvesh, and thank you to all our participants for having attended this session, MOCA's first session on Zoom. And hopefully we'll bring you many more interesting sessions with interesting and, resource people on different aspects of Goan history, art, and architecture. Thank you all.